Have you ever been in an argument where no one engaged your actual point? Where instead of addressing what you said, they told you that saying it was the problem? Where the question of whether you were right was never raised, only the question of whether you had the right to raise it? I want to start with something that happened to me not long ago. I was in a conversation with someone who had recently returned from a 10-day Vipassana meditation course. He was pressing me, not physically, but with that particular social pressure that dresses itself as concern, to perform an act of affection on cue. To demonstrate love at the moment, the script required it. When I hesitated, the pressure increased. When I eventually pushed back, the response was not engagement. It was, "Why are you being difficult?" Notice what that response does. It does not address whether the expectation was reasonable. It does not ask whether love performed on command is love at all. It simply reframes my resistance as the problem. The question of what is right is replaced by the question of why I am causing discomfort. And in that replacement, something important has happened, something that goes far beyond one conversation in one room. What happened in that room is a precise, small-scale example of how power actually works. Not through force, not through law, not through anyone consciously deciding to dominate anyone else, but through the management of what is thinkable, through the transformation of a social script into a moral obligation, and the transformation of anyone who questions the script into a problem to be solved rather than a person to be engaged. This video is about that mechanism, about how power operates below the level of obvious coercion, through language, through normalization, through the very categories we use to think about ourselves and the world, and about what three of the most important thinkers of the last century, Michel Foucault, Antonio Gramsci, and B.R. Ambedkar, discovered when they looked at it clearly. By the end of this video, you will see power not as something that exists in governments and laws and institutions. You will see it as something that exists in ordinary conversations, in the words people use, in what they treat as obvious, in what they cannot imagine questioning, in the words they speak that, as I was once told, are not even originally theirs. Part 1. The wrong picture of power, and why IT matters. Most people carry a picture of power that looks something like this. There is a ruler, a government, a boss, a law. That authority tells people what to do. People obey because they fear punishment. Power flows from the top down, through explicit commands, enforced by visible threat. This picture is not wrong. It describes one form of power, but it is radically incomplete. And its incompleteness is not an accident, it is itself a function of power. Because as long as you are looking for power in governments and laws and explicit commands, you will not see the far more pervasive, far more effective form of power that operates in the texture of ordinary life. The power that does not need to command, because it has already shaped what you want. The power that does not need to threaten, because it has already determined what you consider thinkable. Foucault called this the most dangerous kind of power, not the power that says you cannot do this, but the power that has already determined what this means. Not the power that punishes transgression, but the power that has shaped you so thoroughly that transgression does not occur to you. The cage whose bars are invisible because they have become the walls of your mind. Gramsci called it hegemony, the ability of a dominant group to make its particular interests appear as universal common sense, to make the world as it serves them look like the world as it simply is. And Ambedkar saw it operating with devastating precision in the caste system, a hierarchy so successfully internalized by those it subordinated that its perpetuation required almost no external force at all. Three different thinkers. Three different contexts. The same discovery. Let's look at each one carefully. Part 2. Foucault. Power is everywhere and comes from everywhere. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher and historian who spent his career doing something unusual. Instead of asking who has power and how do they use it, he asked how does power work? What are its mechanisms? What are its techniques? And what he found disturbed almost everyone who encountered it. Foucault's central claim is this: power is not a thing that someone possesses. It is a relation, something that happens in every social interaction, in every institution, in every act of classification and normalization. And crucially, it flows in all directions, not just from top to bottom. As he wrote, power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. What does this mean in practice? Foucault studied prisons, hospitals, schools, and psychiatric institutions, and in each one he found the same mechanism. Not rulers commanding subjects, but systems producing norms. A norm is a standard of what is considered healthy, sane, intelligent, moral, or appropriate. Once a norm is established, everyone within the system is measured against it. Those who conform are treated as normal. Those who deviate are treated as problems to be corrected, educated, healed, or punished. The critical insight is that this normative power does not require a visible enforcer. Once people have internalized the norm, once they have come to see it not as an imposed standard, but as simply how things are, they enforce it themselves. On themselves and on each other. The prisoner in Bentham's panopticon behaves as if they are always being watched, even when the guard tower is empty, because the possibility of surveillance has become enough. The person who has internalized a social norm monitors their own behavior, polices their own thoughts, and experiences deviation not as rebellion, but as shame. Foucault called this disciplinary power, a form of control that operates not through force, but through the production of docile bodies. Individuals shaped by norms they no longer experience as external constraints, but as internal necessities. You don't need a guard if the prisoner has become their own guard. You don't need a censor if the person has learned to censor themselves. And critically for Foucault, power and knowledge are inseparable. What a society treats as knowledge, as truth, as fact, as obvious, is always already shaped by power relations. Who gets to define what counts as rational? Who gets to define what counts as healthy? Who gets to define what counts as a legitimate way of living? These are not neutral questions, answered by pure reason. They are questions whose answers reflect and reinforce existing power structures. Foucault called these regimes of truth, the historically specific frameworks that determine what can be said, who can say it, and what will be dismissed before it is heard. Part 3. Gramsci, Hegemony, and the Power of Common Sense. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist philosopher who wrote his most important work in prison. Arrested by Mussolini's fascist government in 1926, he was told by the prosecutor that we must stop this brain from functioning for 20 years. He spent 11 years in prison, writing in code to evade censorship, and died in 1937. His brain having produced, in captivity, some of the most important political philosophy of the 20th century. Gramsci's central question was, why do people consent to systems that work against their own interests? Why do the subordinated so often accept, defend, and even actively enforce the arrangements that subordinate them? The traditional Marxist answer was false consciousness. People are simply deceived. Gramsci found this inadequate. People are not stupid. They are not simply fooled. Something more sophisticated is happening. His answer was hegemony, the process by which a dominant group secures the active consent of those it dominates, not through deception, but through the naturalization of its worldview. The dominant group's values, assumptions, and ways of seeing the world become common sense. They are absorbed into the culture, into education, into language, into the stories people tell about themselves and their society, until they are no longer experienced as the interests of a particular group. They are experienced as simply how things are, as obvious, as natural, as the way any reasonable person would see the world. The genius of hegemony and its power is precisely that it does not feel like power. It feels like reality. When a social arrangement has achieved hegemony, questioning it does not feel like a political act. It feels like a personal failure, like ingratitude, like stupidity, like being difficult. Think about what this means in concrete terms. When someone tells you that maintaining relationships with people whose company you find harmful is a social obligation, when they frame your withdrawal as selfishness and your discomfort as irrelevant, they are not making an argument. They are asserting hegemony. They are presenting one particular set of social arrangements as if it were simply the natural order of human life. And the power of that assertion lies precisely in its invisibility. It does not feel like an imposition. It feels like common sense. Gramsci's prescription was what he called the war of position, a long-term cultural struggle to contest hegemony by building alternative common senses. Not just political arguments, but new ways of seeing. New stories. New frameworks for what counts as normal, reasonable, and human. The counter-hegemonic work is not winning an argument. It is changing what arguments feel necessary in the first place. Part 4, Ambedkar, the most precise diagnosis B. Ambedkar understood everything Foucault and Gramsci were theorizing, and he understood it not as an academic, but as someone who had lived at the receiving end of the mechanism they were describing. Ambedkar's analysis of caste is the most precise diagnosis of power through normalization in any philosophical tradition. Caste, he argued, is not primarily maintained through force, though force backs it up when necessary. It is primarily maintained through the internalization of a worldview in which the hierarchy appears natural, divinely ordained, and morally necessary. When the subordinated come to see their own subordination as the correct order of things, when they police the boundaries of caste themselves, enforce its rules within their own communities, and experience violation of those rules as a moral transgression rather than an act of liberation, the system has achieved something no amount of external force could: self-perpetuation. Ambedkar's most devastating observation was about tradition. He argued that tradition, any tradition, is not self-justifying. The fact that something has been done for generations, that the community agrees on it, that it carries the weight of the past, none of these facts constitute a reason for its value. The only legitimate question is, does this tradition serve human dignity, freedom, and the capacity for genuine thought? If it does not, the fact that it is traditional is not a defense. It is an indictment. He made a further point that I want to dwell on. He distinguished between what he called the form of a tradition and its principle. A tradition can maintain its form, its rituals, its language, its social practices, long after the principle that gave it meaning has been abandoned or forgotten. When this happens, you have something particularly dangerous: the appearance of meaning without its substance, the performance of values without their content, and a community that mistakes the performance for the thing itself. This is why Ambedkar insisted on prajna, wisdom, critical inquiry, as the foundation of the Buddhist path. Not ritual, not community belonging, not the comfort of inherited forms. The willingness to examine every inherited assumption and ask whether it serves human flourishing. Metta and karuna, compassion and loving kindness, are not sufficient without prajna, because compassion without wisdom is manipulable. It can be weaponized to demand compliance in the name of love. It can be used to make the maintenance of a harmful tradition feel like a moral virtue. Part 5. The soft face of power. How IT operates in ordinary life. Let me now describe the mechanism as precisely as I can, because once you see it clearly, you will find it everywhere. Power in its soft form operates through 4 moves. Each move is individually reasonable sounding. Together, they constitute one of the most effective systems of control ever developed. Move 1. Naturalization. The existing arrangement is presented not as a choice, but as the natural order of things. Not this is how we have decided things should be, but this is simply how things are. How families work. How communities function. How reasonable people behave. The historical and political choices that produce the arrangement are made invisible. What is contingent appears necessary. What was decided appears inevitable. Move 2. Moralization. Conformity to the arrangement is framed as virtue. Friendliness, respect, love. Compassion, gratitude. Deviation is framed as vice. Selfishness, arrogance. Ingratitude, coldness. Notice that in this move, no argument is ever made for why the arrangement is valuable. The moral vocabulary does all the work that evidence should do. Think about what people will say is not a reason. It is moralization, the transformation of social anxiety into ethical obligation. Move 3. Pathologization. If moralization fails, if the person continues to resist, their resistance is explained not as a considered position, but as a symptom. They are troubled, difficult, in need of help. The offer of therapy is not always genuinely therapeutic. Sometimes it is the power move of last resort, the suggestion that your deviation from the norm is evidence of disorder rather than evidence of independent thought. Foucault spent an entire career documenting how psychiatry functioned as exactly this kind of normalizing power. Move 4. Delegitimization. If pathologization also fails, the final move is to deny the persons standing to hold their position at all. Not your argument is wrong, but you have no right to make this argument. Why did you choose to be born here? You'll understand when you're older. Everyone else manages, why can't you? These are not responses to arguments. They are attempts to remove the person from the conversation entirely, to make their position unspeakable not by refuting it, but by questioning whether they are the kind of person whose positions deserve engagement. The person who sees these 4 moves clearly has not escaped power. Power is, as Foucault insisted, inescapable. It operates in every relationship, including the relationship of resistance. But seeing it clearly changes your relationship to it. You are no longer confused about what is happening. You are no longer persuaded by moralization that has no argument behind it. You are no longer wounded by delegitimization that cannot address your actual position. And you are no longer tempted by naturalization into mistaking the contingent for the inevitable. Closing the words you speak, someone once told me, are not even originally yours. They were right, though they did not mean it as the philosophical observation it is. Most of what any of us thinks, values, and treats as obvious was installed before we were old enough to examine it. The language we use, the norms we enforce, the moral vocabulary we reach for when someone does something unexpected. It arrives preloaded from a culture, a community, a tradition that made its choices long before we arrived. This is not a reason for despair. It is a description of the starting point. The work is not to find some impossible position outside of culture and power. There is no such position. The work is to develop enough clarity about how the mechanism operates that you can distinguish, with some reliability, between the values you have genuinely examined and chosen to keep, and the values you are performing because the cost of not performing them is social pain. Foucault said, "Power is everywhere." Gramsci said, "The dominant worldview has made itself common sense." Ambedkar said, "Wisdom is the foundation, and without it compassion is manipulable." All three are saying the same thing from different angles. The most important form of freedom is not political or legal. It is epistemic. It is the freedom to look at what you have been given, to see it clearly, without the fog of naturalization and moralization, and to decide, with your own mind, what is worth keeping. That is what this channel is about. Not rebellion for its own sake. Not cynicism. Not the rejection of all tradition or all community. But the refusal to let social pressure do the work that argument should do. The refusal to mistake the performance of values for their substance. The insistence, quiet but firm, that friendliness is two-way, that wisdom precedes compassion, and that the words you speak should, eventually, be originally yours. Drop a comment below with one thing you were told was simply how things are that you later realized was a choice. I read everyone. Subscribe to Sovereign Mind for philosophy that takes these questions seriously. See you in the next one.